As the German army surrendered and began to retreat, Hans couldn't accept the reality of defeat. In a panic, he rushed to the seaside, frantically reporting that he had spotted Soviet soldiers. However, the German soldiers, exhausted and eager to return home, paid no attention to him. They only wished to get away from the war as quickly as possible. Hans, determined to fight on, tried to get a gun from the soldiers, hoping to single-handedly confront the Soviet army. But all he received in return were mockery and disdain, and he nearly got beaten up for his trouble. Furious and disillusioned, Hans ran off into the woods to vent his frustration. Using rocks as makeshift grenades and holding a knife, he mimicked the motions of a brave warrior, acting as though he were a true soldier. But just then, Hans spotted Soviet soldiers in the distance, and all his earlier courage vanished. Trembling in fear, Hans scrambled to hide in a pile of grass, trying to stay as still as possible, afraid that the enemy might spot him. The Soviet soldiers launched a surprise attack, throwing the German civilians and soldiers on the beach into a panic. In a frantic rush, they leapt into the sea, hoping for a slim chance of survival. After the Soviets left, the beach was left in ruins. Hans managed to find a machine gun, though it was out of bullets, and scavenged a uniform from a dead soldier. Putting on the ill-fitting uniform, Hans strutted back in triumph, but he unexpectedly encountered the same Soviet soldiers he had just seen. The captain, noticing that Hans was just a child, immediately ordered his men not to shoot. But Hans, terrified, turned and ran. The Soviets pursued him relentlessly. Hans fled into a nearby orphanage, hiding quickly in its interior, but in doing so, he brought disaster upon the place. The seasoned captain, however, didn't act rashly. Instead, he called the head of the orphanage out and, with a sharp, commanding gaze, ordered him to hand over the soldier. The headmaster, pale with fear, nervously explained that there were only nurses and children inside, and there was no soldier to be found. Enraged by this, the captain demanded that everyone come out, threatening to kill them all if they didn't comply. As it turned out, the headmaster was telling the truth. Inside, there were only children and 2 female nurses. Meanwhile, Hans, still hiding behind a door, believed the Soviets intended harm and, mustering all his courage, stepped out with the gun in hand, shouting at them to leave. Upon seeing him, the Soviets immediately raised their guns in warning, but the captain ordered them not to fire. Calmly and without showing any emotion, he walked toward Hans, waited for the right moment, and swiftly snatched the gun from the boy's hand. The headmaster, terrified, begged for mercy, explaining that Hans wasn't a soldier but his 13-year-old nephew. However, Hans stubbornly insisted that he was a soldier in the 8th Infantry Division. The Soviet soldiers, amused by his naive and childish declaration, couldn't help but laugh. One of them stepped forward and knocked Hans out. With that, the main Soviet force marched on, heading toward Germany, leaving behind a trail of destruction.